Hello, music teacher friends. Welcome to episode number 49 of the Beyond Measure podcast. My name is Christina Whitlock, and in case you haven't heard, I just hang out here in your favorite podcasting app, ready to be your anytime piano teacher friend whenever you need one. All are welcome in this space, especially overworked music teachers who need a little extra solidarity right about now. So, thank you for tuning in today, my friend. The last couple of weeks have involved some pretty heavy thinking around here, haven't they? We have spent the last 2 weeks working on our relationships with our inner critics, which, of course, is not always a pleasant task. So, today, I promise not to make you work quite as hard. We are going to keep today's episode breezy and actionable. I would like to introduce you to my rule of 3. So, let's get to it. To properly introduce my rule of 3, I want to take you back to June of the year 2006. Yes, 15 plus years ago, I was sitting in the salon chair while my favorite stylist friend, Leah, prepped my hair for my wedding day. I had all the 20-something anxious bride vibes flowing, and my dear friend Leah gave me this piece of marital advice. She said, "If you want your husband to know something, you have to tell him 3 times." I laughed it off, but she stopped and shook the hairbrush at me, and she said, "I'm serious. 3 times, or he is not going to know you said it. It's just the way it is. 3 times. I still laugh because I can picture the seriousness with which she said those words. And, well, let it be known, first of all, that I married the best, and it doesn't always take 3 times, but I would definitely argue that all of us, regardless of gender or age, benefit from hearing important things multiple times. In fact, those words of advice have proven to be one of the most effective strategies for teaching that I have ever encountered. I don't know if it's that 21st century attention span or complete lack thereof that we all know too well, or what it is, but this is basically another way of reminding you of what I've been saying the last several weeks, that just because we say something, it doesn't mean your students have learned it yet, right? And here's the neat thing about Leah's advice to me on my wedding day. It's actually backed up by lots, and I mean lots, of research. And this is no surprise, of course, to musicians. I mean, we of all people know the importance of repetition. No one masters a musical instrument without lots of repetition. And since our art form rests so heavily on the idea of doing things over and over again until our neural pathways get on board, as teachers of music, we need to make peace with the fact that this means we will be telling our students the same things over and over again. And yes, this is true in so many areas of life. So whether you are applying these ideas to teaching, to marriage, or to any kind of leadership, the idea of saying important things at least 3 times has some very consistent applications across the board. In fact, the CEO of LinkedIn is known to use a quote that cites something to the extent of this: "If you want to get your point across, especially to a broader audience. You need to repeat yourself so often that you get sick of hearing yourself say it. And only then will people begin to internalize what you are saying. Well, we all have a few things we're probably a little tired of saying, am I right? Especially since not only do we just tell one single student the same thing multiple times, but of course, we actually spend our days telling multiple students the same thing multiple times. By the end of any given weekday, I have no clue how many times that day I have needed to remind students to keep the pulse of their music moving forward. Every single day. How many times a day do I remind students that rests carry every bit of importance as the notes do, if not more? Here in Piano Teacher World, we offer lots of reminders of which hand is indeed the left hand. Reminders to keep eyes on the score and not fingers. Reminders not to simply just grab the first black key they find when they find an accidental on the page in front of them. I could go on, but you know the drill. I have always been fascinated with why it feels so frustrating to have to repeat oneself. I suppose it is mostly a reaction to feeling as though we are not being heard. We can't help but feel disrespected if we say something to a student and it doesn't seem like they have paid attention, right? But so many times, it is not as simple as the student was not just paying attention. Have you ever had that experience where you swear you catch a student not listening to you, and in a fit of frustration, you say, "So, student, can you tell me what I just said to you?" And you're so sure that they're not going to have any clue, but they actually just go ahead and repeat you word for word. And then you have to just nod your head and say, "Okay, just checking." We'll have to save my thoughts on why students don't seem to be paying attention for another episode. It's on the calendar, I promise. But suffice to say, we never fully understand what's going on inside our students' brains, and it rarely does us any good to try and guess. Not to mention the fact that this is not strictly a matter of whether or not they're paying attention. Think of all the practice hours we could have saved ourselves if we only had to hear instructions one time. Have you ever stopped and thought about how many times your teachers had to repeat themselves to you? And you were an exceptional student, I'm sure. I am convinced that there are certain concepts in the music studio that just have to be heard more than once. In my experience, the rule of 3 holds pretty true in the studio, though sometimes it's even more. I'm quite well known to say the phrase, "however many times it takes is what it takes." So, for example, here's a scenario that comes up for me a lot. Within a student's first few piano lessons, they will inevitably ask this question. "Hey, what do each of these 3 pedals do down here?" Well, I'm a big fan of encouraging curiosity whenever possible and helping students understand the instrument in front of them. So we will usually take a break and dive into a fun exploration of the piano and the 3 pedals. So I get them up, they're looking inside the piano, I give them some drills so they can each try 3 of the pedals themselves, the whole shebang. I feel like my spiel is pretty interactive, it's age appropriate, it's not too technical, yet it gets the job done. I don't think I'm talking too much as we explore. I mean, these are all things that I feel add up to a recipe for successful learning. But you know what? Some of you already know where I'm going with this. I would say that maybe 60% of those students end up asking me the same question at some point in the not-so-distant future. And honestly, I used to get pretty irritated about it. I would tell them, don't you remember that day I had you stand over here in the bend of the piano and we watched the dampers as they came up and down and we looked for the hammers underneath the strings and we observed how they moved and then I had you come over here and so on and so on and so on. And most of the time they'll say, yeah, kinda, but I forget what that left pedal does again, or something like that. It seems as though, in a lot of cases, this is very simply information that most students need to hear a few times, especially since we barely use two of those pedals for quite some time in piano study. That is definitely a contributing factor. But that's just one example. I have come to decide that most students need multiple lessons on Roman numeral analysis before that really sinks in. I believe they need multiple explanations of compound meter before they really, get it. And the list goes on and on. If you've listened to this podcast for very long at all, you already know I'm going to tell you that we can't just talk ourselves in circles when it comes to introducing concepts. It reminds me of years ago, I used to play for a particular voice studio where the teacher said probably at least 15 times per lesson, you just need to engage the body, engage the body. And of course, he was trying to help his vocalists sing from a place of better support. But I just always wanted to shout out, say it a different way. This, my friends, is not the kind of repetition I'm talking about. The rule of 3, in the music studio anyway, is a terrific reminder for me to attempt to introduce concepts 3 times, preferably in different ways, using as few words as possible before I expect a student to fully understand it. The ins and outs of that will vary depending on what concept you are introducing. But here is the real crux of this episode. We, as teachers, should expect to repeat ourselves quite a bit. 100% plan on introducing concepts more than once and in different ways because our students are very likely going to need it. It's just the way the brain works. So if your student is not picking up on a concept after your initial explanation, it doesn't mean there is something wrong with him or with you and the way you explained it. It just means that you need to keep explaining and maybe try it from a different angle if that's possible. Whatever it takes is what it takes. And when we, as teachers, come to accept and embrace the fact that explaining concepts multiple times in multiple ways is the job, well, I think it goes a long way to help alleviate the frustration that can come from having to repeat ourselves. Pay attention to what spikes your frustration this week, will you? If it has anything to do with feeling exhausted over repeating yourself, I would first tell you to go back and listen to episode number 42, which is Cheers to Talking Less, and see if perhaps there is any chance you are using too many words. But then I would also ask you to take a moment to reflect on the fact that, to an extent, thoughtful repetition is an enormous part of our job. Now hear me, I say thoughtful repetition because it's not at all that I think we should be repeating ourselves over and over again, word for word, but rather we want our students to internalize the principles of music making we are providing them. And the research is very, very clear that this really only comes through frequent repetition. And now, let's move on to my favorite revisited concept of every week, a toast to you. Music teacher friends of the world, it is my hope that the rule of 3 may serve as a guiding force in your life this week and beyond. May you find solace and purpose in the idea of embracing this approach of thoughtful repetition. Let's all go into our week fully understanding that repetition is the foundation to all learning, whether that's in music or in science or relationships or whatever the case may be. May you shift your perspective today to embrace repetition as a powerful tool instead of a source of frustration. And with that, I say cheers to you, my wise, wise friends. Hear, hear. Thank you for listening to episode number 49 of the Beyond Measure podcast. I want you to get excited because next week is my first ever Q&A episode where I am answering questions that you submitted last week. If there's a chance you did not get a question submitted and would still like to get it to me, I will be taking them through Wednesday of this week, which is October 27th. Simply message me on Facebook or Instagram at Beyond Measure Podcast, or drop me an email at beyondmeasurepodcast@gmail.com. It has been really fun to see what you guys are interested in knowing, and as expected, the current submissions are pretty much all over the map, which should make for a pretty entertaining episode. Thanks so much, my teacher friends. We'll head into our week prepared to work hard, rest well, and be nice. Let's talk soon.